How would a Biden administration handle China?
Well, the first thing is we have to dig out from a strategic deficit that I'm afraid President Trump has put us in, because right now, by every key metric, China's strategic position is stronger and ours is weaker as a result of the president's leadership. Think about it this way. President Trump has helped China advance its own key strategic goals, weakening American alliances, check. Leaving a vacuum in the world for China to fill, check. Abandoning our own values and giving Beijing a green light to trample on human rights and democracy in places like Xinjiang or in Hong Kong, check. And then maybe worst of all, debasing our own democracy by attacking its institutions, its people, its values every single day, and so reducing its appeal compared to China. That's what I call checkmate. So the real challenge, Kevin, is that we have to put ourselves in a position of strength. And ultimately, it's about us. It's about making sure that we renew our own democracy, that we invest in our own workers, that we actually revive our partnerships, and that we put our values front and center. If we do that, then we can engage China from a position of strength. And that's what Joe Biden would do as president.
Well, let me follow up on that because Republicans in the Trump administration argue that the level of unpredictability and the isolationist foreign policy strategy has enabled the United States to take more of a brash tone against Beijing. However, what I'm hearing from you is that ultimately for the American worker, the strengthening of the alliance is actually going to be more beneficial in the long run. You know this. Across the country, people are incredibly skeptical of China stealing their jobs.
Yeah.
So from an economic perspective, how come strengthening alliances would be better protect American jobs?
Because when we're actually engaging China to curb some of its practices that we profoundly object to, other countries are in the same situation. And if we're working alone to try to press China to change its ways, we're about 25% of the world's GDP. If we're actually acting with other democracies who are similarly aggrieved, that's 50 or 60% of the world's GDP. That's a lot harder for China to ignore. But instead of doing that, President Trump has actually alienated the very partners we would want with us to deal with China. He's launched tariff wars against them. The French president at one point, Macron, went to President Trump and said, you know, we should work on China together. We have the same kinds of problems. And President Trump apparently turned to him and said, why would I work with you? The EU is even worse than China.
Well, to that point precisely, as it relates to technology with Europe and 5G and their weighing of utilizing Huawei, for example, from a national security perspective, how would building a broader technology coalition with U.S. allies work to diminish some of the advances that Xi Jinping has been able to make on the technological front?
Well, this is interesting because if you think about it, the world increasingly is divided between techno-democracies on the one hand and techno-autocracies on the other hand. If the techno-democracies can come together and work together to write the rules, to shape the norms, to build the institutions through which technology is going to be used and governed, and if they can infuse their values into the technology to the extent technology has values, we'll be in a much better place to make sure that the technology that dominates our lives is used in a good way, not a bad way. The problem is the techno-democracies aren't well organized. They aren't working well together. And largely, that's because the United States has pulled back and pulled out. Or when it is engaged, it tries to browbeat other countries into doing what we want instead of working with them, finding a common way forward.
You mentioned Hong Kong, and in particular, obviously, China has taken a much more aggressive approach regarding Hong Kong. How would a Biden administration handle that aggression in what is an important symbol of democracy, but also, of course, a financial hub?
So the first thing to do is to make sure that if you're president of the United States, you're not giving China a green light to crack down on democracy in Hong Kong. Remember, a year ago, when the protests were kicking up again because of this increasing crackdown on democracy, President Trump said, I stand with President Xi Jinping. That is a huge signal of impunity to Beijing that it can proceed without fearing repercussions. So the first thing to do is to have a president who's not going to greenlight a crackdown on democracy. I think at this point, unfortunately, we have to recognize the reality and no longer treat Hong Kong with the fiction that it's autonomous. And we need to work on deterring further crackdowns, hopefully incentivizing international companies to leave. We can't let, in effect, Beijing eliminate what it doesn't like in Hong Kong, which is political freedom, but keep what it does. this large international corporate presence. So, there are lots of things that one could do, one could look at in terms of Hong Kong's role in international organizations and maybe pulling them out of those organizations, actively supporting the relocation of U.S. businesses, and also helping Hong Kong residents who want to leave come to the United States, as the UK is doing, and then step up defenses of Taiwan's democracy by exposing Beijing's efforts to interfere.
And that's exactly where I wanted to follow up on is how would a U.S. policy with a Biden administration address Taiwan because of what we've seen with Hong Kong specifically? What would he do?
So look, the irony is that Taiwan has actually been a big success story over the last decades in terms of the way both China and the United States have handled it. We have not allowed it to become a flashpoint. We've had the accords that we've reached with China. We also have the Taiwan Relations Act, and that's allowed Taiwan to flourish and prosper. But of course, if China is getting signals of impunity, if the government in Beijing thinks it can act against democracy in Hong Kong with impunity, if it can crack down on Uyghurs with impunity, then one's concerned that it may conclude that it can do the same with regard to Taiwan. Ironically, there too, what it's doing is only feeding those in Hong Kong who would take a policy approach that Beijing objects to. So I hope we can get back to at least managing Taiwan the way we have from Republican through Democratic administrations over the last decades.
Tony, here in Washington, D.C., Republicans and Democrats have been able to find behind the scenes some common ground in terms of ways to deal with China, and particularly have raised concerns, bipartisan concerns, about China's lack of transparency in their handling of the coronavirus pandemic. Clearly, there are differences between Republicans and Democrats as it relates to the World Health Organization. But how does the presumptive nominee Joe Biden feel that Xi Jinping should be handled, or China as a whole should be handled, for their lack of transparency with regards to the pandemic?
Well, very differently than President Trump has handled the government in Beijing. Remember what happened. First, even before the pandemic, the Obama-Biden administration had put in place defenses against emerging pandemics, programs and people to make sure that, to the best of our ability, we could predict, prevent, and mitigate, including in China, because we knew this was a growing threat to global health and to American health. Unfortunately, tragically, President Trump dismantled virtually all of those programs and pulled the people back. Then when the virus emerged, and it was so critical for China to come forward with information and to make the different places available and accessible to international experts, it wasn't doing that. And instead of calling the government in Beijing to account, President Trump spent the better part of 2 months praising their cooperation and transparency, probably in large part because he wanted to downplay the virus. And he was also very desperate to hang on to the trade agreement that had been reached in mid-January and that he wanted to make sure the government implemented. So you've got to start by actually insisting that China live up to its responsibilities. Here's the other thing, though. One of the ways that to go forward to make sure that we get to the bottom of this and that the government in China is appropriately held accountable is to empower the World Health Organization to get into the right places, to have access to the scientists, to have access to the information. Well, what does the Trump administration do? It pulls us back and out of the WHO, leaving room for China to fill the vacuum and to dominate the organization, making it a lot less likely that it will ever be empowered to really investigate what happened.
You know, last week, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, speaking at the Nixon Presidential Library, posed the question nearly 50 years after former President Nixon traveled to China, saying, after that historic trip, what has the American worker gained from engagement with China? And meanwhile, of course, we're coming up on the 100-year anniversary of women getting the right to vote in this country. And I think about former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's 1993 trip to Beijing when she spoke at the United Nations and said that women's rights are human rights, both from an economic and a cultural perspective. What can be done in 2020 to get China to cooperate, not just with the global order economically, but also on issues pertaining to civil rights?
Look, let's put this in perspective. Remember that before the opening to China, the opening to China was about our interests, not China's interests. It made sense strategically. It made sense as a way to pull China and the Soviet Union apart. And it made sense in terms of taking down tensions. Remember, we were fighting two wars in Korea, and also Vietnam, ultimately, that China was engaged in. And the opening to China really took down the temperature on that. And then the economic opening, of course, it benefited China, but it actually benefited us too, in terms of affordable products for our consumers, affordable inputs for products that we were adding value to, and indeed for American jobs. And China remains one of the fastest growing markets, at least before the COVID-19. So we need to put this in perspective. And I think painting with those kind of broad brushstrokes, as Secretary Pompeo did, is very, very misleading. But look, going forward, I think we have to assert ourselves, our own values, our own democracy. And when we do that, when we're strong at home, when our democracy is strong at home, including with a strong women's agenda, then we're in a much better position to advance that agenda around the world. President Biden would start from day one with a woman vice president. He would start with a cabinet that looks like the country, an administration that looks like the country, including the participation of women. And he's put forward a very, very significant women's agenda to empower women in our economy, in our country. If we set the standard and we become, again, the role model, if we lead by the power of our example, not just the example of our power, that's how we can have an impact, including in China.
And just one final question for you. Earlier this week, President Trump told Axios that when he spoke with Russia President Vladimir Putin, that he did not raise the issue of the bounties regarding Afghanistan. I wanted to get your response to the president not raising that issue with Putin.
So, Kevin, I mean, it's mind-boggling. I mean, remember this: President Putin over a year ago was with President Trump in Helsinki. They stood together, and President Trump on the world stage with Vladimir Putin took Vladimir Putin's word over our own intelligence officials about Russia's meddling in our last elections. He's done Putin's bidding in undermining Ukraine. He gave President Putin his dream in undercutting and taking a 2x4 to our NATO alliance. But maybe most egregious of all, he apparently has done nothing when he learned that Russia put bounties on our troops in Afghanistan. In fact, worse than nothing. By his own acknowledgement, President Trump has spoken to President Putin, I think 7 or 8 times since the report first crossed his desk. He didn't confront Putin even once by his own acknowledgement. And then, even knowing what he knew, what he was told about these bounties, President Trump tried to invite President Putin to Washington, D.C. and get Russia back into the G7, the group of the world's leading countries. This is a total dereliction of duty. It's a total betrayal of our troops. And by the way, there's a pattern here. When reports emerged in the president's daily brief about the coronavirus, and again, this is the most sensitive, important intelligence a president receives every day. I sat in with President Obama and Vice President Biden for 6 years with these reports every single morning. When reports emerged in the PDB, the president's daily brief, about the coronavirus, apparently President Trump either didn't read it or ignored it. So this is a dereliction of duty.